Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Book of Kings, where we discuss topics such as history, religion, philosophy, culture, and more, and the way that they all interact with each other. Don't forget to like, leave a comment, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to receive a notification every time I release a new video. Hope you enjoy. Hello, everyone. We are back for part 2 in our series on the relationship between race and civilization / belief system / culture, etc. We had previously talked about the theory of clinal variation, which discusses how differences in phenotype, i.e. physical appearance, occur gradually across geographical areas. And most importantly, we talked about how the dividing lines between one quote-unquote race of people and another have been set by civilization, which includes, amongst other things, ideology / belief system, i.e. religion and or philosophy, and how they have also been influenced to a lesser extent by language and culture. Now, with this final episode in this series, we are going to discuss how arbitrary these lines separating large groups of people are and how they have fluctuated and changed throughout the course of history. So, just like in the last video, we are first going to delve into this topic by talking about Europe. So, Europe is considered the home of the European race, or the white race. So people from North Africa are not considered white or European. People from the Middle East are not considered white or European because they do not subscribe to Greco-Roman and or Christian civilization, whereas Europe does. Well, for anybody who thinks that, no, they're separate, anybody who's not from Europe is not white, is of a different race, I would like to point out that, as I said before, there's no clear-cut geographical separation between Europe and Asia. The current boundaries of Europe are relatively malleable and or semi-recent, but these boundaries were not always the same boundaries. Now, let's talk about classical times. The Roman Empire. The Roman Empire really picked up the mantle of Greek civilization, and they ruled over a large swath of land. They ruled over a large part of Europe, but they also ruled over North Africa. They also ruled over large portion of the Middle East, modern-day Iraq, Syria, Israel, Lebanon, Egypt, etc. So largely all the lands within the Roman Empire were part of this same broader Greco-Roman civilization. And then upon the arrival of Christianity, a lot of these people were Christian as well. So they were Christian and patronized Greco-Roman civilization. And like I said before, these concepts of race are, in my opinion, largely based upon civilization. Did the people of Roman civilization view the people who are part of North Africa and the people who are part of the Middle East, who were part of the Roman Empire and followed that same Greco-Roman Christian civilization, did they consider them different from the ones in the European portion? No. Those arbitrary lines had not been drawn yet. They saw themselves largely as part of the same civilization. Okay, and if we look, a lot of the great figures in Greek philosophy were from North Africa. They were from parts of the Middle East. For example, the philosopher Zeno, who is the founder of the school of philosophy of Stoicism, was from modern-day Cyprus and was of Phoenician background. The Phoenicians, of course, being an ancient people originating from modern-day Lebanon. A lot of the figures in early Christianity were from North Africa and the Middle East. For example, early church father St. Augustine was from Numidia, which corresponds to parts of modern-day Algeria. And of course, as many may already know, Christianity originated in the Middle East. So that flies in contrast to the notion that there's some inherent biological difference separating someone from Europe from someone from the Middle East and North Africa. And also, to add to that, all that region was all considered part of the same civilization because they followed Greco-Roman civilization and Christianity. And also on that same note, other people who were part of other parts of Europe who did not follow that civilization were not considered part of the same civilization and macro-cultural group as people of the Roman Empire. For example, so you had what is today Europe, Southern Europe, and England were part of the Roman Empire, but the Northern Europe was not. Northern Europe were pagans. They were more nomadic. They were what people within the Greco-Roman civilization would consider barbarians. Do you think people from ancient Greece and or Roman Empire considered the pagan Germanic peoples of Northern Europe as part of their same civilization, macro-cultural group? No, and I'm not sure if I would full on say that they even had a concept of race as we do today, but if they did, I would largely say that no, they would not consider the people of Northern Europe to be part of the same race. And it's documented that Romans and Greeks largely thought people from Northern Europe were actually inferior. They thought that they were mentally less intelligent because, one, they did not follow the same civilization. They did not follow Greco-Roman and or Christian civilization. And as opposed to other competing civilizations, which they might have been rivals with, such as the area of the Persian Empire, which subscribed to Zoroastrian civilization, the people of Northern Europe, they were pagan. They didn't even have a written civilization. So one, the Romans considered the people of Northern Europe, the Germanic peoples, as other, and they even considered them inferior because they considered them barbarians, they're illiterate, they're pagan, they're nomadic, etc. So if you were to bring somebody now who is espousing the idea that all the people of Europe are the same race and there's something inherently unifying about the European or white race, if you would tell it to a Roman that, hey, a Germanic barbarian from the north is the same as a Roman or a Greek or somebody from Gaul, which is modern-day France, or Iberia, modern-day Spain, if you're going to say that somebody from the Roman Empire is the same as somebody from the nomadic Germanic lands, that they're the same, the Romans would probably staunchly disagree, to put it mildly. So again, this shows that these lines about where one race/macro group begins and the other ends is largely based upon civilization. So people from the territories of the Middle East and North Africa, which were part of the Roman Empire, would have been considered part of the same civilization, same macro group as the people of Southern Europe. With the arrival of Islam, now these regions came under Islamic rule. And then these regions then, of course, adopted the Islamic religion over time and then developed a unifying civilization and culture. And then now they were considered as a separate civilization and a separate macro-cultural group. Why? Because of civilization. Civilization, culture, religion, ideology, etc. And then, shortly after that, Christianity would then spread to Northern Europe, and all of Northern Europe would then patronize Greco-Roman civilization and Christianity. So now the former barbarians, the people of Germania, Germany, Northern Europe, Scandinavia, Netherlands, etc., would in time become Christian and therefore espouse Greco-Roman civilization as well. They were part of the Roman Catholic Church. They founded the Holy Roman Empire. So now they're all part of one civilization. All these people who were previously separate, it was the Romans versus the barbarians. Now they're part of the same civilization. They're Christian. They follow this tradition of the Roman Catholic Church. They take upon these concepts of Tsar or Kaiser, rooted in the name Caesar. So now they're part of the same civilization. And that's the origin of where we see the boundaries of modern Europe develop. It's the region where, while it initially was not all dominated by Greco-Roman civilization and Christianity, in time became the region which was dominated by that ideology and that civilization. And by virtue of that whole region having the same civilization, same culture, ideology, and also being physically connected, it became viewed as a cohesive region of the world and then became viewed as a continent. And then from being viewed as a continent, the people of that continent became viewed as part of the same racial category. Okay, so that's just an example of how there are, in fact, arbitrary lines drawn in the sand. These lines have, in fact, fluctuated over time, and they are largely, as I've said, determined more by civilization than by some concept of genetic difference. They belong to different civilizations. They have different cultures, ideologies, philosophies, etc. Let's give another example. We were talking before about the Middle East. Parts of the Middle East were part of the Roman Empire, so they largely would have been viewed as part of the same civilization, macro-cultural group as the Greco-Romans. But then other parts of the Middle East, such as Iran, modern-day Afghanistan, the regions which are inhabited largely by Iranian-speaking peoples, would not have been considered part of a unified Middle Eastern culture or civilization. And the Greco-Romans, while they would consider people from modern-day Turkey and North Africa as part of their same civilization, they would not view people from Iran or Afghanistan or Tajikistan as part of their same civilization. Why? Again, ideology. Those regions were part of the Persian Empire, and the unifying feature of the Persian Empire and even Iranian civilization as a whole is Zoroastrianism. And that's a whole nother topic. I know obviously now on paper the majority of Iranians are not Zoroastrian, so that's a whole nother topic for another day. However, like we said, now we think of the Middle East as one unified region, one unified racial category. But we're saying at a time, about 1,500 years ago, these were not considered a unified region. This was not considered a unified culture or civilization. These were considered two separate cultures or civilizations. You had the western portion of the Middle East, Turkey, Palestine, Egypt, North Africa, which was part of the Roman Empire and therefore part of the same culture and civilization as Greco-Roman civilization. So they largely would have been considered Western civilization because they were Christian and they patronized Greco-Roman philosophy. And the other half of the Middle East, Iran, Afghanistan, etc., would have been considered a whole nother region, part of a whole nother civilization, whole nother macro-cultural group, and that would be Greater Iran, or the realm of the Zoroastrians. So, there you go. These were separated based upon civilization, and then in time, as Islam would spread to these regions in the Western Middle East and North Africa, which previously were part of the Roman Empire and previously were part of Western civilization. And it would also spread to Greater Iran, which previously was Zoroastrian civilization. And then now they would all be part of the same civilization, and that is the civilization of Islam, and therefore be considered part of the same region. That is what we call now the Middle East, but it previously was called Dar al-Islam, the realm of Islam. And then now it's being considered to be part of its own racial category, and that is Middle Eastern and North African. So again, that's another example of how our concepts of race have largely been dictated by culture, civilization, philosophy, ideology, etc. And we're going to give another example. I don't want to go on too many tangents here, but I think it's one last good example, and that is Greater Iran versus the Indian subcontinent versus South Asia. So, of course, Iran, Afghanistan, parts of Pakistan are very close geographically to the Indian subcontinent, but they are now and have previously been considered separate macro-cultural groups. Now the difference is Greater Iran is considered part of the Middle East because it subscribes to Islamic civilization, and the Indian subcontinent subscribes to Dharmic civilization. Well, previously, when Greater Iran was still Zoroastrian and they were their own separate civilization, they were also considered a separate macro group from South Asia. And what was the dividing line? How were these two groups considered separate and considered part of different cultural groups? Again, civilization. Greater Iran was Zoroastrian. South Asia was part of the Dharmic civilization. And in fact, to go a little bit more into what we talked about in a previous video, I talked about how the people of Greater Iran and the people of the Indian subcontinent both had the same cultural origin. They both were descended from the people known as the Aryans. Well, these were originally one people. So how did these people, the Aryans, become split into two separate groups? And these separation in groups can even be reflected in linguistics. You have the Indo-Iranian language family, which can be split between the Iranian group and the Indo-Aryan group. How did the Indians and the Iranians, how did they become split? Well, initially, the Proto-Iranian peoples practiced a religion very similar to Proto-Hinduism, very similar to what would eventually become Hinduism. And these two civilizations split when there was a prophet called Zoroaster who preached monotheism and started the oldest monotheistic religion in the world, Zoroastrianism, and therefore that eventually spread to what would become Greater Iran, and then that would be the origin of how these two regions, which originally had a very similar culture, became split into two larger macro groups. Again, civilization, Zoroastrianism versus Dharmic civilization. So that is my last example. I know I've given a lot of examples. Now you're probably asking yourself, that doesn't include all of what we consider to be different races in our world today. That doesn't include Native Americans. That doesn't include Sub-Saharan Africans. I would say that in time, after the spread of European colonialism, and you had people from Europe spreading by sea to other regions of the world, well, they're coming into contact with people who are separated by large swaths of land, right? So let's say they're viewing European civilization in comparison to the Middle East, right? Obviously, they consider them to be parts of different civilizations in different worlds, but they're connected by land, so they can see the gradual change in physical appearance from themselves to this other group that they view as separate. However, with colonialism and Europeans spreading to large portions of the world by ocean, you're coming into contact with people who are very geographically far away, and as a result of this, look very physically different. And then based upon that, they're not able to see the gradual difference between their group and this other group. Therefore, their main way now of categorizing people, it now becomes physical appearance rather than culture and civilization. And this would have especially been the case given that many of the peoples from the regions they were traveling to didn't necessarily subscribe to a unified religion, philosophy, culture, etc., which was dominant across a large geographical area, as was the case with some of the other groups and regions discussed in this and the previous video, such as the broader Middle East and North Africa, which were dominated by Islam, or East Asia, which was largely dominated by the trinity of Confucianism, Taoism, and or Buddhism. So this would further reinforce the perspective of grouping peoples into broad categories based largely upon physical appearance, as opposed to civilization, ideology, culture, etc., as would have largely been the case in the past. For example, sub-Saharan Africa. There are large portions of Africa which are Islamic, which previously may have been lumped in with Islamic civilization. For example, in Spain, in medieval times, they viewed sub-Saharan Africans and Middle Easterners / North Africans as part of the same group, who they referred to as Moors. But now, as Europeans were traveling to parts of sub-Saharan Africa further away, which were outside of the Islamic world, and coming into contact with peoples who were not a part of Islamic civilization, and had a variety of diverse belief systems, ideologies, cultures, etc., and therefore could not be lumped in with another larger macro-cultural group, the primary means used by Europeans for categorizing these peoples into broader groups became physical appearance, for example, skin color, as opposed to civilization, ideology, culture, etc., as it had previously been. At this point, being that physical appearance had become the primary means of placing people into larger groups, peoples from parts of sub-Saharan Africa that were a part of Islamic civilization were now placed by Europeans into the same broader category, i.e. race, with peoples who may or may not have been a part of the same civilization, yet shared certain common physical features such as skin color. Now, of course, today, the majority of people from sub-Saharan Africa outside of the Islamic world are Christian, but at this point, this was not yet the case. So now let's take the example of the people of the Americas. So Native American societies didn't patronize any of the other belief systems that we had previously discussed, so they couldn't be grouped together with the people who were a part of those civilizations, and additionally, they subscribed to a variety of diverse belief systems and cultures. And due to the fact that no particular large regions of the Americas subscribe to one unified ideology, worldview, or culture, the way in which the Europeans categorized the various different peoples of the Americas was based upon, as we discussed, physical appearance. The natives of the Americas that the Europeans had come in contact with were, of course, separated by a great geographical distance, and therefore were quite different from the Europeans in terms of physical appearance. And in addition to physical appearance, their geography also played a role in the Native Americans being included together as one larger group or race, with the Americas being one unified landmass separated geographically from the Old World. So while we're on the topic of geographical location, that leads us to another exception to the rule of conceptions of racial categories being determined by civilization, ideology, etc. So in the last video, we talked about the example of the Philippines. Now, of course, the Philippines are largely Catholic and therefore Christian, so one may be inclined to include them with Western civilization. However, the people of the Philippines are largely included within the larger East Asian group, even though they do not patronize Confucianism, Taoism, and/or Buddhism, as most of the other peoples who are categorized as East Asian do. We talked about in the last video how this may be due to the influence of Chinese culture on the Philippines due to the influx of Chinese traders into the Philippines throughout history. This may also be due to their geographical location. They are separated by a large geographical distance from Europe, which has historically been the region dominated by Christianity. But they are, of course, in close geographical proximity to the Confucian, Taoist, and/or Buddhist world, and being a small country, therefore become grouped together with the larger East Asian group. The same would apply to Indonesia, Brunei, and Malaysia. These countries are largely Muslim, however they are separated by a large geographical distance from the rest of the Islamic world. However, they are in close proximity to the Confucian, Taoist, and/or Buddhist world, and again, being smaller countries, are grouped together with that larger civilization. And I want to specify that this designation and categorization of an East Asian group doesn't necessarily indicate the way in which these peoples included within this group view or categorize themselves, but rather how they have been viewed and categorized by the Western world. Another example of smaller groups of people being included within a larger group of people with a different civilization or belief system would be the Islamic peoples of the Balkans. Specifically, the countries of Bosnia-Herzegovina, Albania, and Kosovo. The people of these countries are largely Muslim, however they are surrounded nearly on all sides by predominantly Christian nations and therefore have become categorized with the rest of Europe as European or white, as opposed to being grouped together with other primarily Muslim peoples as Middle Eastern/North African. So, geographical proximity, as well as the categorization of groups based upon physical appearance following colonialism, are two exceptions to the rule of the concept of race being in large part defined by civilization, religion, philosophy, culture, etc., as discussed in this and the last video. And I want to emphasize that while I tried to make this video so it could be enjoyed on its own, this is the second installment of a two-part series, so I would highly encourage you to watch my last video in addition to this one. And of course, to have even more context on this topic, I would highly encourage you to watch the video I did on clinal variation as well. So yeah, that's it. That is my theory on this topic, as well as some of the exceptions to this theory. So yeah, let me know what you think. Feel free to write your thoughts in the comment section, whether you agree or have a different perspective on this topic. As I always say, it's always good to have dialogue and share ideas and information, whether you agree or disagree. So there you go. Hope you enjoyed this series. Thank you for watching. This has been another Book of Kings video. Don't forget to like, leave a comment, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to receive a notification every time I release a new video.